What flowers are used in a Japanese garden? This is a very common question I get asked when talking about a design or building your own Japanese garden, but not one that is easily answered. Flowers have a different role in the Japanese garden than they do in Western style gardens, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a place in them. We're going to talk about the most common flowers used in traditional Japanese gardens, as well as some ideas of incorporating them into a home garden. So, what flowers are used in the Japanese garden? The flowers most commonly used in Japanese gardens, depending on your hardiness zones, are Japanese irises, liriope, the muscari, and spicata varieties, yabudan in Japanese, and balloon flower, or kikyo. But you'll find that to add color to the landscape, flowering shrubs like azaleas, rhododendrons, and flowering trees like camellias and magnolias are more often than not what would be considered a true flower. Modern Japanese garden designers are, however, expanding their repertoire and starting to use a larger display of varieties. But I have to say that some are done more successfully than others, and it is still a somewhat controversial topic on how far is too far, how much is too much color when you're discussing a traditional Japanese garden and the direction that they're headed. Japanese gardens are designed to be appreciated in every season of the year and often don't highlight specific flowers. Perennials are chosen over annuals for a number of reasons. For example, annuals often have very bold tropical colors, and Japanese gardens are often designed with a more subtler flavor to them. Perennials are continuous, but also represent a season. They also often bring something to the scene even when not blooming. Different flowers, shrubs, and trees bloom at different points throughout the entire year. A plan of how to integrate these colors into your garden design should be thought about. Harmonizing the different foliage and textures of both the softscape and hardscape is more important than highlighting a particular flower. Large flower groupings over variety. In general, you'll find that gardens in Japan tend to stick to a few types of flowers and plant them all throughout the garden. Whereas in the West, we like to have a variety of color combinations, and the Japanese garden often stays with one or a few staples and may have a few different colored varieties of the same species. Many Japanese gardens and Japanese temple gardens are famous for one particular type of flowering element, and they're planted then in masses. This may be because they have found that this particular variety of flower thrives in that particular climate with the right amount of moisture, shade, sunlight, etc. And they've decided to double down on that variety. It can also highlight a local species. Tourists travel from all over Japan in search of what is local and different from their particular neck of the woods. So visiting a garden and temple in search of local varieties is a common hobby. It also draws on a particular season and highlights a time of year. Cherry blossom trees, which are actually rarely used in traditional Japanese gardens for these reasons, have an extremely short blooming season, and most flowers in the garden are chosen for more overall seasonal displays. The Japanese garden may not use a wide variety of flowers per se, but that doesn't mean that they lack color. When considering the overall year-round look of the garden, they do it in a way that also appreciates the details of shades of greens as well. The Japanese language has a variety of different words for shades of green, and it's often mentioned in particular when talking about Japanese gardens' seasonal colors. Flowering shrubs. Japanese Pieris are a great flowering shrub that has become more popular outside of Japan. So there's a fairly good chance that you'll be able to find the shrub to add some staples of purple to your garden. Spiraea Thumbergii, or yuki yanagi in Japanese, is another flowering shrub that you'll probably be able to find locally. Azaleas and Rhododendron need to get a special mention here because they're probably the most often used shrubs in Japan, or in Japanese gardens. They can be somewhat particular about the types of growing conditions, so you may have found that one type grows better than another in your area. I would say that azaleas tend to be used more often than rhododendron because the smaller flowers they produce and the ability to prune and shape them are better than the rhododendron. They often use a mound and create a beautiful miniaturized mountain scene that seamlessly wrap through boulders and providing a solid evergreen backdrop that can be appreciated all year long. Some varieties of rhododendron can grow somewhat wild and are harder to keep condensed. Peonies, or Botan in Japanese, are another flowering shrub that you can often see in Japanese gardens and especially temple gardens. They have a bold flower, so they often get planted in large formations. Wisteria is a vining plant with cascades of blue to purple flowers that can often be seen in Japanese gardens hanging from a pergola or an archway in spring and early summer. This vine is a fast and aggressive grower though, and can sort of take on a tree-like trunk that will need a good amount of pruning. They get really heavy, so the structure needs to be very solid that they're built on. You can use it in a way to section off your garden or as an entryway maybe, but it's rarely used as the main point or the main focal point. Flowering trees. Camellias, both the Sazanka and Yabutsubaki varieties, are also great flowering trees that you can use in the Japanese garden. They make a great backdrop of evergreen and work well to create a hedge and define the garden space. Make sure you don't prune it too hard though. Magnolias also make a great tree for the garden, providing white flowers with a touch of red or pink. Similarly, euonymus are a fast-growing and a beautiful option for flowering color to add. The Japanese Snowbell, Styrax, is another great flowering tree that fits great along a pathway. Two major symbols of Japan are the Japanese cherry tree, Sakura, and the Japanese plum tree, Ume. Although many people associate these trees with Japan, they're not really used in the garden itself. They're beautifully flowering trees for a short time that do represent a particular season, with plum trees coming in a variety of white, pink, and purple flowers at the end of winter, and then cherry trees that symbolize that spring has arrived. You do, however, see them as a backdrop behind or beyond the actual garden, and you can use them to bring some color to the overall scene, but their bloom time is often quite short. They really shouldn't be pruned very hard, so they don't provide much aesthetic value after flowering. Although they're not prized for their flower, Japanese maple trees, momiji, and ginkgo trees need to be mentioned. These trees provide a beautiful seasonal highlight of color that goes far beyond what flowers can do. Momiji in particular can be a featured specimen or can make up a solid backdrop of reds, oranges, and yellows in autumn. A lot of pruning can go into a maple tree to highlight the branches and to create a wonderfully curved trunk as well. Even when the leaves aren't on it in winter, the branches and their shapes provide unique lines for the eyes to follow, making this a year-round pleaser. Ginkgo trees often grow very tall and make for a great background tree with bright golden and yellow leaves in fall. You can see these in gardens and temples and shrines as well. So when you're searching out what type of flowers to use in a Japanese garden, I'd like you to sort of adjust or broaden your thinking to include the bigger picture. Often with flowers, what you're really after is the color they bring to a garden scene. This can be achieved in a Japanese garden, but we need to include a broader definition of flowering. Flowers and color in the Japanese garden aim to remind us of how fleeting life is. It represents the continuousness each season has, but fades away. It continues, but is never the same. If you've had some success with flowers in your garden, or you visited a Japanese garden that highlighted a particular flower, please share it down below in the comments so we can all learn and discuss.